Howdy, and welcome back to Economic and Legal Considerations for Hemp Production in Texas. I'm George Knapek, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the amount of hemp that we're growing in the United States. So, like any good economist, you come with a disclaimer that you have to remember the hemp industry is very infant at this point. Very new, still growing and growing rapidly, changing rapidly. So data has been hard to come by and in some cases isn't necessarily consistent. So what I'm going to do today is go over some data that I found, go through, talk about licensed acres, planted acres, and harvested acres. And in most cases they're all different, so you need to know which one is being reported. And I'll talk about those as we move along. But before I start, I wanted to go over a couple of reports and let you know that in 2020, still the predominantly grown use of for hemp was for CBD. A Jacobson study said that over 90+% was for some type of cannabinoid production, and you had about 3 point something for seed and another 2.5 for fiber. A different data source, New Frontier Data, came out just recently with their report for the 2020 hemp crop, and they too basically came up with the same data in that 92% of the total acreage of hemp in the United States was grown for some type of cannabinoid production. And you can see by the map there where Texas ranks in that production status, and we're at 1%. So you can see Texas is behind such states as Colorado, Tennessee, and Arkansas. This map here shows the number of years that hemp has been planted in certain states, and it goes from 2014 to 2019. Now, on this map shows Texas with a 0. That's because 2020, if you remember, 2020 was the very first year we had legalized hemp production in Texas since the Controlled Substance Act. That said, if you look at the map, you can see there are a number of states, being Oregon, Colorado, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, that have a big head start, 5 or 6 years of head start in hemp production, because they started earlier with their pilot programs than Texas did. So it's not surprising to see that those states would have more acres than Texas. So this is licensed hemp acreage in 2020. So licensed acres is not the same as planted, but you can see where most of the permits to grow hemp are occurring. And again, it's in those states that have been growing this for the most part for a number of years, and that being Kentucky, Tennessee, Colorado, but you can also see a big pickup in Arizona and California. As I mentioned, permitted acres are not the same as planted acres. And in this slide set here, you can see that about roughly half of what gets permitted or licensed gets planted. And then planted often doesn't equate to harvested. In 2019, Vote Hemp estimated that about half of what was planted got harvested. Now that was just a 1-year data source, but if you think about it for 2019, half of what was permitted got planted, and half of what was planted actually was harvested. So in this data set here, we're going back in time. I want to show the growth of acres that we've had in this country. And you see the first column there is the year, and then it's the source of data is the planted acres by Vote Hemp, then the planted acres by the USDA, FSA, and then the number of states that were actually growing hemp at the time. And so you can see we started off in our infancy there in 2015, but I want you to pay particular attention to the growth from 2017 to 2018 and from 2018 to 2019. Not only did we grow the number of states, but the acreage essentially tripled from 17 to 18 and then tripled again from 18 to 19. That's a huge amount of supply being pushed onto the market. This slide here is similar to the previous slide, but it has even another data source, which is acres reported by state. And you can see those three, much like Vote Hemp differed in the amount of acres on the previous slide from the USDA, so does the acreage reported by the states. And again, I go back to my disclaimer in that, data is still, in this relatively new industry, is still kind of hard to come by and find consistency. What you will notice from this is that the FSA acres are generally lower than the other two data sources. Most people seem to think that FSA acres are probably potentially a little bit low than what's actually happened, in part because there's a lot of new growers of hemp, growers that don't or haven't grown traditional commodity crops and aren't used to reporting their acreage to the FSA. And a lot of these growers are still working under pilot programs, which in some cases don't have that mechanism to report to the FSA, but they report to the states. So there are some issues of reporting here that hopefully when everybody gets under the same umbrella, will work themselves out. So I took the Vote Hemp planted acres and on this graphic and put it in comparison to some other planted acres of crops that are more traditionally grown in the U.S. or have been grown for a longer period of time, I should say, than our hemp. And you can see just kind of on a relative scale where hemp stacks up. It's kind of in the same realm as mustard, safflower, and flax. And we grow still about 10 times the amount of sunflowers and peanuts each in this country as we do hemp. As for a little bit more perspective, I added in this planted acres graphic and included cotton this time. And you can see hemp is that little green sliver at the very top, the amount of acres that Vote Hemp said we planted in 2020. And you can tell by this, still a relatively very small share of the crop acres in this country. 2020 was the first year since we started growing hemp again in 2014 that we saw a decline in acres. As I mentioned, those acres increased, tripling and then tripling again, which brought on a ton of supply, ton of new supply. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, 90+% of our supply in this country is going towards the production of cannabinoids, mostly CBD. So what happened? Bring on that much supply, kind of overwhelmed the market. The price dropped precipitously from 2019 into 2020, dropping in somewhere in the range of about 80%. When you see that kind of price decline, obviously it sends a signal to the market, and what we've seen is 2020 was the first year that we actually had a decline in hemp acreage in this country. And most of the decline was seen in Montana, Colorado, and Kentucky. But we did see the hemp licenses, you have to have a license to grow hemp. We did see those producer licenses actually increase in 2020, even though the acres were down. In part because we brought on 13 more new states, Texas included, in 2020. We went from 34 states to 47 states from 2019 into 2020. So more producer license, but less acres. More likely what we saw was some of the states that have been growing this for a longer period of time, their acres cut back and new acreage pop up in some of these states that hadn't grown it before 2020. So lastly, where are we in Texas? As I mentioned, it was our first year to grow hemp. According to the TDA, we had over 5,000 acres permitted. We had 1,150 producers licensed. That equates to about 4.3 acres per producer if I don't account for greenhouse square footage and licenses. We had 15 million square feet of greenhouse space that was permitted, and 86 registered processors, 14 labs, and 164 handler samplers. These are the folks that are going to come out and sample your field to test your levels of THC. So that was the start we had in 2020. We look forward to seeing what we have in 2021. And with that, I say thank you, and I hope that you are enjoying the series, and I look forward to you viewing the rest of our series. And if you get a chance, please scan your QR code to take a short survey on this video. Thanks.